Oh, we heard that Paul Bebbington and Dinesh Bugra both saying that psychiatry is social. All psychiatry is social. Is this true? Is the Pope a Catholic? It's a silly question. Everybody knows the Pope is a Catholic. Everybody knows that psychiatry is social. But of course, it is rumoured that there are in the Vatican some old traditional cardinals who doubt that the Pope is 100% Catholic. They think he is too liberal. But also, in psychiatry, there are those who doubt that psychiatry is social, and many of them are American. Sam Guzzi, for example, wrote a paper called Biological Psychiatry, Is There Any Other Kind? In 1989, and some of you will have followed the development of the RDoC, the NIMH system for classification of psychosis. Tom Insel was the main instigator. And of course, this is based on neural circuits, genomics, and animal studies, and pays no attention whatsoever to social factors. So there are those who say psychiatry is social, and there are those, a minority in this side of the Atlantic, who say that psychiatry is predominantly biological. But I want to try and talk about the two together. And in doing that, I'd like to discuss the social factors that Paul Bebbington and yesterday James Kirkbride suggested, well, not suggested, but demonstrated are risk factors for psychosis. Not all well established. That childhood adversity, migration and belonging to an ethnic minority, bullying, increasingly important, the effect of bullying, or rather we've realized its importance, and adverse life events and stress. All of these increase the risk of psychosis. But what I'd like to ask, what is the mechanism whereby these social factors increase the risk of psychosis? Does the incidence vary across Europe? And if so, what is the reason? And why do only some of the people who are exposed develop psychosis? If you think of child abuse, many people are exposed to child abuse. Some develop dependencies, some develop depression, some develop psychosis, some are entirely resilient. What is the reason for that? The reasons are quite simple in terms of biological factors. I'd like to just say a little bit about biology of psychosis, and it's very simple. It's essentially D and G, not Dolce and Gabbana, but dopamine and genes. So biological psychiatry is quite simple. There are only two things you need to know about the biology of psychosis. So we know that when people are acutely psychotic, they show an excess synthesis of striatal dopamine. So in the striatum, the neuron synthesizes and produces too much dopamine. Unfortunately, our drugs are not sufficiently sophisticated to impact on this, so we spend our time blocking the D2 dopamine receptor. And we now know that dopamine, striatal dopamine, is raised, is excessive, not only in schizophrenia, but also in mania. This is a paper by Samir Johar, just published last month, this month, last month in JAMA Psychiatry. Here you can see measuring with fluorodopa, radioactive fluorodopa. Here is the control levels of dopamine synthesis in the striatum. Here are people with schizophrenia, and here are people, bipolar people, manic people. Very difficult study to do, to get manic people to go in the scanner. So these are mildly manic people. But you can see, very similar. Why do people with schizophrenia respond to dopamine blockers? Because they have an excess of striatal dopamine. Why do people with mania respond to dopamine blockers? Because they have an excess of striatal dopamine. But if the final common pathway to psychosis is striatal dopamine, can social factors cause this? This is a very nice study by a lady called Mizrahi in McGill, and she took 12 high-risk subjects in the prodrome just before they were developing psychosis, and 10 drug-naive patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then they gave them the Montreal stress test. This is a rather, it's not an easy test, this. It's when you're given arithmetic, which is just too difficult for you to do. So you're always failing. And they tell you that you're doing this as part of a group. Perhaps we take all the professors along the front line here, and we give them some arithmetic, and we tell them we will publish the results. And so everybody tries very hard. But they tell you, they always make it just too difficult for you to do it correctly. So it's very, very stressful. And here are people who are controls. I don't know if you can see this, perhaps in the front row, a very little blue, and that is the excess of the dopamine synthesized when people are stressed. But you can see people who are high risk, there's a much bigger increase in those people in the prodrome in dopamine. So they are more prone to develop the increase in dopamine in response to stress. And here are people who've already developed a psychosis, already schizophrenia, and you can see they're particularly likely to develop a high level of dopamine. So stress causes release of dopamine in all of us, but more so in people who are predisposed to psychosis or people who have already developed psychosis. This is a very nice study by Alice Egerton looking at the question of child abuse. And we heard from Paul and others of the important role of child abuse. And in this study, again, looking at fluorodopa uptake in the striatum, and you can see here are people who have experienced child abuse in their childhood. Here are people who have never experienced child abuse. The people who have were exposed to child abuse 20 years previously or more, they develop higher levels of dopamine in response to this study. And similarly, people who have had several arrangements in their childhood, that perhaps parents have been divorced and they've gone from one family to another family, they are also more predisposed to develop high levels of dopamine. So present stress, childhood stress make you more prone to develop high levels of dopamine. And another study of migrants, quoted actually by James Kirkbride yesterday from Dr. Mizrahi in Canada. Here are healthy volunteers. Here are people in the prodrome, high risk, and here are people with schizophrenia. In the black are non-migrants. In the grey are migrants. And you can see that the people who are migrants in each group produce more dopamine. So stress, child abuse, migration all increase dopamine synthesis. So they are risk factors and they operate on the dopamine system. But we know that drug use can also increase dopamine synthesis. So we've known this for 50 years. Amphetamine, you give people a lot of amphetamine, dopamine goes up in the synaptic cleft, people go psychotic. And we know also that this is the case for cannabis. Cannabis, THC also increases striatal dopamine, not to such a great extent as amphetamine, but still increases it. And this is the relation. This is a meta-analysis done by one of our many Italian colleagues, and this is Dr. Marconi, a meta-analysis in which she took all the different studies which have looked at a psychosis in relation to the extent of cannabis use. Here are the baseline where people are not using cannabis. Here is at the highest level. This is the highest 20% use of cannabis. And you can see that in every study, the people in the highest group were significantly more likely to develop psychosis. On average, the odds ratio is 4. Now you wonder why is the risk only going up a little bit in these studies and much more in these studies? And the answer is that these studies are modern studies in which people are exposed to much more potent cannabis. This, for example, is Dr. Tien's study back in 1990 when cannabis was still quite dilute. Now it's much more concentrated and has a greater effect. So the final common pathway to psychosis is dopamine dysregulation. Both social factors and drug use can impact on the striatum to dysregulate dopamine. So we can have a model as to the development of psychotic symptoms that some people, for biological reasons, for environment, for their childhood environment, they have a sensitized dopamine system. They are then exposed to some acute stress, or they're using too many drugs. And as a result of that, they release too much dopamine. And you'll be familiar with the theory of salience, that dopamine is involved in grabbing your attention, making you pay attention to things, making the environment appear much more immediate and much more important. Therefore, you think everything around is of significance. So you get this aberrant processing of stimuli, and Kapoor and others have shown that this is one of the reasons for the perceptual abnormalities that people have in acute psychosis. But if you've had a particularly adverse childhood and you've perhaps been abused, or you've been a migrant and you've been exposed to discrimination, you perhaps learn to be suspicious of the outside world, and you may interpret things in a paranoid way, that adults are against you or white people are against you. Therefore, when you have these aberrant processing of stimuli, you may interpret these in a biased way. And this may result in paranoia and frank psychosis. Once you're psychotic, you believe that the people down the road are trying to be against you, or the CIA are trying to influence your thoughts, or your parents are trying to poison you. This is very stressful. So you get much more stress. This causes release of dopamine. You get more paranoid, more psychotic. Maybe you have to go into hospital. You get into hospital, you're very fearful of what's happening. You think you're going to be poisoned, and the nurses come along, want to give you tablets, and you say no. And they say, well, I'm afraid, and your family say you're going to have an injection. You become convinced you're going to be poisoned by the injection. This causes more dopamine release and more psychosis. So you get into a vicious circle of increased release of dopamine, increased psychosis. So what can we do about this? Well, we can try and reduce the stress or reduce the drug use. We can block dopamine. That's all. We can't interfere with the synthesis as yet. I hope in the future we'll be able to do that. We can use CBT to address the effects of childhood abuse or of discrimination. And perhaps we can also use new psychological therapies such as avatar therapy to actually address the hallucinations or the delusions that people are having. So we have a range of ways of trying to normalize this cycle, and in many people we can do it. In a small proportion, people will go on to develop a more chronic psychosis. But increasingly, we're realizing that with good treatment, people can recover and the dopamine system can normalize. Next question is, does the incidence of psychosis vary across Europe? And if so, what causes this? So this is a very big study called the EUGI study, led by Jim Van Os, costing 12 million euros, and looking at the incidence of psychosis across 16 sites in Europe and also in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And in this study, everybody was trained to use exactly the same methods. The researchers were all brought together and taught in the same way to interview the subjects. And also, to make sure they got every case from particular areas. So, for example, we have Verona, Bologna, and Palermo, and in these areas, the researchers took a particular area of the city. In Palermo, it was the whole city, for example, and attempted to get every case of psychosis over 2 years into the study. Now, maybe we missed some. Maybe we only got 90%, but we tried very hard across the EU to get similar, carefully defined levels, and we're able to work out the incidence of psychosis. And here is the incidence, and you can see here the highest incidence is in London, 61 per 100,000, Amsterdam, 47 per 100,000, Paris, 44 per 100,000. So the big northern cities have a very high incidence of psychosis. The southern cities, so if we take Spain, for example, here is Madrid, 24 per 100,000. Here is Barcelona, 12 per 100,000. Other sites in Spain, relatively low. And here are the sites in Italy. Of course, we don't have Milan or Rome. It would be a very nice thing to do, to calculate the incidence of psychosis in Milan and Rome, to see whether it goes with the other smaller Italian cities or whether it goes with the northern big cities. But this is actually a slide of Dr. De Fortis, who last night pointed out that she had made a big mistake in her life. She'd started off in Palermo and migrated to London, thereby increasing her risk of psychosis 5 times. But what about Santiago? So this little place in northern Spain has an incidence of psychosis 1/10 of that in London. Did they miss some cases? Maybe they missed a few. They didn't miss 9 out of 10 cases. So I think we have to accept that there is a big variation. There are already studies, actually, previous studies from Ilaria Tarraconi and from Mirella Ruggeri and colleagues showing also, and Alicia Mulli, also showing that low rates of psychosis in Italy. So there seems to be no doubt that the incidence of psychosis is much lower in Italy and also in Spain than it is in the northern big cities. So what is the reason for this? What is the explanation? Could it be the Mediterranean diet? Possible. Could it be vitamin D? Possible. Well, Santiago is actually, which had the lowest, is not actually in the Mediterranean, it's in northern Spain. Could it be migration? Yes, I think in Paris and Amsterdam and London, we have had large numbers of migrants for very many years. You're now beginning to have a lot of migrants, but it hasn't had time to percolate through to the effect on psychosis. What else could it be? Well, it could be my friend the Pope. Could it be that the Pope was having a beneficial effect? Well, as you notice, I'm a great admirer of the Pope, but he's quite recent. It's unlikely that he's been able to have this effect in the few years that he's been Pope. But, excuse me, could it be families? We heard from Norman Sartorius on Thursday that a much higher proportion of the population of London is occupied by single people. I think he said 26%. Whereas in Italy, families tend to stick together. I understand it's difficult for parents sometimes to get rid of their sons. Even in their 30s and 40s, they're still at home. Again, I understand that you don't have so much of a problem of social isolation, at least where I know in Palermo. But the problem is social intrusion. Everybody knows your business, but it's much more difficult in places like London and Amsterdam. It's much more easy to become isolated. And of course, the other question, could it be high-potency cannabis? So this again is Dr. De Fortis' work, and this is looking at the frequency of cannabis used across the EU in relation to the odds ratio of psychosis. This is high-potency cannabis that's having the big effect. So over here is the use of low-potency cannabis, which doesn't seem to have much of an effect. But if you're using high-potency cannabis, in London we call it skunk, in Holland it's nederweed, and different names across Europe, but cannabis is becoming increasingly potent. In Holland you can now get nederweed with 60% THC, as opposed to what we used to have in the 70s, 4% THC. So cannabis is becoming more potent, and its daily use of cannabis, highly potent cannabis, this is the odds ratio, this is the adjusted odds ratio. If you're using high potency cannabis every day, you're about 4 times more likely to develop psychosis. Well, if you were to go down the street today, what kind of cannabis would you be offered? Anybody? Any high potency, you think? Well, we don't have data for Naples. It is possible, but by and large, very little high potency in Verona and Bologna and in Palermo. In Palermo, again, Dr. De Forti said this yesterday, the only people who had ever used high-potency cannabis were actually controls, and they had used it on a weekend holiday to Amsterdam. In Palermo, you just couldn't get high-potency cannabis. But this is the prevalence of daily use of cannabis in population controls. How prevalent is cannabis use in the population, and comparing it with the incidence of psychosis. So here you can see in the green daily use of cannabis in controls going up and down, and in red you can see the incidence of psychosis. And you can see that the two are in parallel, that there seems to be a relationship, that the cities with the big high incidence of psychosis are also the places where cannabis is used most frequently and where cannabis is most potent. London, Amsterdam and Paris, whereas in Palermo, for example, Bologna and in Brazil, cannabis use is less common, the incidence is lower. So if you actually look at the correlation between cannabis use and the incidence, it's 0.75. And if you calculate the population attributable fraction, it is 20%. So if nobody used cannabis daily across Europe, we could get rid of 20% of cases of first episode psychosis. So just as Paul Bevington calculated the population attributable fraction for child abuse, if we can do the same for cannabis, and we could get rid of 20% if people didn't use cannabis daily. But why do only some people who use cannabis, for example, develop psychosis? Well, perhaps there is some genetic predisposition. And this, again, a study done by an Italian colleague, Marco Colisi, who came to us from Bari. And this is a study in which he took people with no cannabis use and people with cannabis use, and then genotyped them for 2 genes involved in the dopamine system, DRD2, the dopamine receptor, and AKT1, which is a gene post the receptor, signaling after the receptor. And you can see that if you didn't use cannabis, your genotype didn't matter much. But if you used cannabis and you had no risk genes from either DRD2 or AKT1, this was your risk. If you had one risk allele, this was your risk. If you had a risk allele from both DRD2 and AKT1, this was your risk. It went up 7 times. So it's common, at least in London, to see a young man and you say, do you think your psychosis could have something to do with your consumption of cannabis? And he will say, no, it's impossible because all my friends smoke more than me. But he may just be unlucky to carry the genetic susceptibility. We now know that there are lots of genes for psychosis. Actually, 256 genome-wide significant hits. Probably there are different genes which make you susceptible to cannabis use, different genes that make you susceptible to child abuse, maybe to discrimination or adverse life events. And we'll be able to look at these over the next few years. But we also know that the genetics has taught us something, well, has reinforced something we were beginning to know anyway. We used to think that schizophrenia was a discrete category, that there were mad people, a couple of percent out of 100, and there were sane people. But we now know the difference is not so great. Sane people, normal people are not necessarily sane. And we know that the idea that there are 100 genes, 200 genes, is much more compatible with the idea of a normal distribution. There'll be people here with a low number of susceptibility genes, people here with a high number of susceptibility genes. If you encounter social adversity and you have a low number of susceptibility genes, then this will have relatively little effect. But if you have social adversity and a high level of susceptibility, you're more likely to go psychotic or to develop schizophrenia. So this is again compatible with the idea which we heard again from Professor Bevington, that minor psychotic symptoms exist in the general population, and the same factors impact on these as impact on psychosis, cannabis use, living in a city, social adversity, and so on. We also now know that the risk genes for schizophrenia overlap with the risk genes for bipolar disorder, depression, and neuroticism. So again, what does this imply for classification and treatment? Well, no wonder we have such difficulty distinguishing between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, because 60% of the susceptibility alleles are in common. And of course, I also showed that they both are associated with increased striatal dopamine. And again, Professor Bevington talked about how many people with schizophrenia also have anxiety and depression. Well, that's not surprising, since the genes for schizophrenia overlap with the genes for depression and neuroticism. So let me conclude. I think social and biological approaches are necessary to understand psychosis. I think we now need to move towards the prevention of psychosis. Now, some people have tried to do this by having outreach clinics for prodrome patients. This produces very interesting research, but it's hopeless in terms of preventing psychosis, because only about 5% of people in London go to a prodromal clinic who then show up in the first episode psychotic patients. We really need to decrease the prevalence of obesity. You have to address the eating habits of a general population, and it's the same for psychosis. We cannot change the biology of psychosis, but we can attempt to decrease exposure to risk factors. Decreasing the rates of child abuse and discrimination towards migrants, I think, is possible, but will be quite difficult. The obvious place to start is by advocating the decreased use of cannabis. And that is an obvious way to go, but we have to notice that cannabis legalization is becoming, and decriminalization is becoming prevalent, certainly in North America, and this has been accompanied by quite a considerable increase in the consumption of cannabis. So it may be that actually the United States and Canada are sleepwalking into an increased incidence of psychosis. I hope we don't do this. Thank you for listening.